Hi, I'm Matt Bufford with Cap Nose Knives. This is the second video in my video series on how to make a knife. Today we're going to work on grinding and sanding of the knife that we've already started. And I've had a couple of requests on video to use the jig that I made another video of. Very simple grinding jig, and we're going to go ahead and use that today for demonstration to fulfill those requests. First, you got to drill the tang to use the jig because the handle is mounted up to the face of this jig through the tang holes. So I'm going to center punch each of my tang holes. I'm going to go ahead and drill those out and mount it to the jig, and then we'll see you at the grinder. Alright, so now that I've got the holes drilled, before I put on the jig, there's one thing I got to do. I got to scribe a line down the center body of the blade. What that's going to do for me is provide me with a guide as I'm grinding along so that I can keep the blade grind straight on both sides. For this, some people use a knife scribe. They're high dollar, they work, and they're very easy, but I've always used drill bits. It's always worked for me, and I've never seen any reason to spend the money. So all I got to do is hold down the drill bit and drag the blade across the bit, and it gives me a line. Then I flip it over onto the other side, drag it across again, and it gives me two lines. So now I've got two lines spaced about a width of a dime apart, which is about what you want the finished width to be on the blade when you're done grinding. So from there I'll go ahead and mount it onto the jig. Now we're ready to grind. Alright, so now we're at the grinder. Just a quick idea of how this is going to work. You use your tool rest on the grinder and just set it on there and slide back and forth. The elevation knob right here will determine the angle of your grind. Since I'm doing a full grind on this one, I'm going to leave it pretty shallow. And if I get into the grind and realize that it's too shallow, it's easy to turn it a couple twists and correct it. Okay, now a couple quick notes on belts. If you ask 10 different knife makers what belt series they use, you'll probably get 10 different answers. I start with a 80 grit ceramic belt to do my beveling. Some people will start with a 60, some people will start with a 35. I don't like the heavier grits because I don't want to remove too much metal too fast. It leaves too much room for error. Or too little room for error, rather. I like to start with the 60 grit, then I'll move up to a 120, 220, and then I'll get into my the Trizac belts. They're a weird combination of glue and grit, but they work really well for the finishing parts. So you have to work your own grit series. You have to kind of figure it out for yourself. Buy some belts, make some knives, and you'll get your grit series figured out. Whenever you're grinding along here, after a few passes, now I've got just a few passes on there. It's not necessarily a straight line yet. I'm not too worried about it at this point, but the blade's getting kind of warm. The jig itself acts as a pretty good heat sink, so you can go a little bit longer than normal if you're just freehand grinding, but you still want to have a dunk bucket and just dunk the whole jig in there, cool the blade down. With these belts, you don't have to worry about drying the blade off. You can just dunk it and go right back to grinding. Okay, so you can see I've made some pretty good progress here. Nowhere near done on the grind. Reason being, you don't want to completely grind one side of the blade and then move on to the other. You stand a chance of warping the blade and causing some damage and stress fractures on the blade. So I do a little bit of grind, and then I'm just going to flip it over onto the jig, move it to the other side, and get about the same level of progress on the other side, flip it back, and do the same thing all over again until I get down to the level I want to be on my 60 grit. After that, I'll move up to 120 grit and keep doing the same thing, flipping it back and forth until I get down to the level of my grind, and do that for every grit series along my belts. Okay, so I've made quite a bit of progress here on my 80 grit belt. I've gotten down to my full grind, and now I'm going to move into the 120. On the 120 grit, this is where I'm really going to start worrying about my plunge cuts. Plunge cuts are the part right here above your choil where the grind actually starts. I'm going to make sure they're even. I'm going to make sure they're profiled identically to each other so that the finished product ends up looking a lot better. One of the hallmarks of a poorly made knife, when you look at the face of it, the plunge cuts won't match. So I want to pay close attention to making sure those plunge cuts match. After that, like I said before, I'm going to move through my belt grits, but then I've got the issue of dealing with the gut hook. And I'll be the first to admit, I've never done a gut hook. I wanted to try one on this knife. I'm going to get my hand files out. I'm going to do it that way, and hopefully that works out for me. If not, I may just grind it off and figure something else out. Okay, so I'm ready to go with my 120 belt. I've got the tracking somewhat offset towards the direction of my plunge cut, and I'm basically going to come in there the same way I was grinding and let it kind of bury into the plunge cut and then work it so that it comes out a little bit straighter than it already is. If you look at it now, you can see that it's somewhat sloped. I want to keep the slope. It kind of helps with the aesthetics of it, especially with a thick piece of stock like this. If it just went straight in, it wouldn't really look right. So I'm going to keep the slope, just even them up. And there we go. Now we've got a nice gradual slope, and not really even angular. It's more radiused. So I'm going to finish grinding this side of the bevel out with my 120 grit. Then I'm going to flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. So now I'm done on a 120 belt. You can see just by the shimmer on the blade that it's already starting to look a little bit more finished. We're nowhere near finished, but your objective as you're going down through the belt grits is to completely eliminate all of the scratches from the previous grit. If you don't take your time to do this, you will absolutely regret it later when it comes to hand sanding, because you will spend way too much time trying to grind out those scratches with sandpaper. Take care of it now when it's on the belt. It'll go a lot quicker. You can see on my plunge cuts, they're even, they're radiused. I went ahead and took some acetone, got rid of my little Sharpie line, but you can see that they match. If they don't match at this point, keep working on it until they do. It's okay if you go a little bit too far. The finished product will still look good, but it'll look way better as long as they match. So now I'm done with my belt grinding series, and at this point I'm done with the jig. You can see by looking at the blade that all the imperfections from the heavier grits are gone. And I went ahead and did some final grinding on the spine too, just to get it all flat and even. But this is where you want to be. At this point in your project, if you see any imperfections at that blade at all, go back to the grinder, go down to a bigger grit, get rid of the imperfections, and then work your way back up. Because like I said before, if you have any deep scratches in there, you are going to absolutely regret it, because your finished product isn't going to be near what you could produce. Next, I'm going to move on to the gut hook. I'm going to put my knife up into a vise, get out my little round file, and go to work with that. But first, I want to touch on using the jig in general. The jig is not a learning tool, and it's not something I would recommend for beginners. The only time I really use it is when I'm doing a production line of knives. I have so many set designs that I use, it's easy for me to set up the jig to a certain angle and do 5 or 6 knives at a time. Makes it a lot easier for me to be consistent with the product I put out to people, and I do have several clients who order 2 or 3 knives at a time of the same design. So I like to deliver a product that is consistent from one to another. I would highly encourage you to learn how to freehand grind first. because using a jig limits your ability. When you're doing a simple blade design like this, it's incredibly easy to use a jig, but it's also incredibly easy to screw it up. If you learn how to freehand grind first, if you get into a tight spot using the jig, you can go back to the basics, use what you already know, and fix what you messed up and not ruin your project. Alright, so now I'm going to attempt to file out this gut hook. Just got a regular round file is what I'm going to use. And, you know, with any other file work, you just make steady, straight strokes. And this is going to take a long time, but this is all I'm going to be doing. And once I get to a point where I need to use some other files and make some adjustments, we'll be back with that. Alright, so I finished up the file work on the gut hook. Luckily it turned out pretty well. I like it. The sides don't match perfectly, but for my first attempt, I'd say it's a fairly good success. From here, I'm going to move on to do the tang. Typically now is when I'm going to taper the tang, which taper the tang basically means it's going to be narrower down at the very bottom, and it's going to be at its basic width at the top. The reason I'm not going to do that on this one is because I have special plans for this tang, and I need it to be full thickness down at the bottom. So what I'm going to do, because I still have to surface grind it, and to get my little effect up the spine of the blade, I have to do a slight taper, but not enough to really affect the thickness overall there. So I'm going to move over to the grinder, go back to a low grit belt, and go back to work with that.